It is, in the end, just a rock, a 10-ton boulder of glacial granite, deposited on this shore some 20,000 years ago. Yet, for 4 centuries, this stone has been asked to bear the weight of a nation's identity. It is Plymouth Rock, the supposed first footstep of the Pilgrims, the cornerstone of the American story. But on the same day that many Americans celebrate Thanksgiving, another tradition takes place here, on the crest of Coles Hill overlooking the harbor, a day of mourning. For the Wampanoag people, the people of the first light, this rock is not a symbol of a new beginning, but a reminder of an end, the end of their world as they knew it. How did one boulder come to represent both the birth of a nation's ideals and the beginning of a genocide? The answer is not in the stone itself, which has no contemporary accounts to verify its role in the landing, but in the complex, tragic, and often misunderstood story of the people who met here. The modern significance of Plymouth Rock lies not in its disputed historical authenticity, but in its function as a physical stage upon which 2 foundational and conflicting American narratives are performed: the triumphant story of liberty and self-governance, and the tragic story of colonization and dispossession. To find the truth, we must look beyond the myth and journey back to a world on the brink of collision. The story of the Pilgrims begins not in America, but in the religious turmoil of 17th century England. Under King James I, the Church of England was the only legal church, and all citizens were required to attend its services. But for a small, radical group of Protestants, it was corrupt beyond repair. They were known as separatists. Unlike the larger Puritan movement, which sought to purify the Church of England from within, the separatists believed it was irredeemably tainted by its Roman Catholic past. They held that true churches were voluntary congregations, independent of any central authority. This belief was an illegal and dangerous act of defiance. Under the Act of Uniformity of 1599, failing to attend official Church of England services was punishable by fines and imprisonment. In Nottinghamshire, a congregation in the village of Scrooby, led by figures like William Brewster and John Robinson, faced increasing persecution from the authorities, who raided their homes and jailed their members. Fleeing persecution, the congregation escaped to Holland around 1608, settling in the thriving industrial city of Leiden. Here, they found the religious freedom they craved. But freedom came at a cost. Life in Leiden was arduous. As foreigners, many were forced into menial labor in the city's textile trades, and the hard work took a physical toll. Governor William Bradford would later write that many were showing signs of early aging. But a greater fear was cultural assimilation. Their children were growing up Dutch, adopting the local language and customs, and being drawn away by evil examples into extravagant and dangerous courses. The separatists feared losing their English identity, and that their tight-knit community would simply dissolve into the tolerant but foreign Dutch society. This anxiety, combined with economic hardship and the looming threat of renewed war between the Dutch and Spanish, became the primary driver for their next more radical move, a pilgrimage to the New World. Their destination, the New World, but the journey would test their faith to its limits. The voyage of the Mayflower was an ordeal of logistical failure, human friction, and sheer terror. The original plan involved 2 ships, the Mayflower and the Speedwell, sailing together. But the Speedwell proved disastrously unseaworthy, leaking so badly on 2 attempts to leave England that it had to be abandoned. Its passengers and some cargo were crammed onto the already crowded Mayflower, which finally set sail alone from Plymouth, England, on September 16, 1620. The 102 passengers were a volatile mix. The separatists, who referred to themselves as saints, were joined by a larger group of secular colonists, merchants, craftsmen, and indentured servants recruited by the expedition's financial backers, the merchant adventurers. The separatists called them strangers. The 66-day voyage across the Atlantic was a nightmare. Passengers were confined to the cold, damp, and cramped gun deck, a space with ceilings no more than 5 feet high, which they shared with a stored boat. Violent Atlantic storms battered the ship for weeks, causing crippling seasickness and constant fear. During one such storm, a main structural beam cracked, threatening to break the ship apart. Disaster was only averted by using a great iron screw, a large jack screw the colonists had brought for building houses, to force the beam back into place. Their diet consisted of salted pork, dried fish, and hardtack biscuits, leading to malnourishment and scurvy. Miraculously, only one passenger died on the voyage, while a baby, aptly named Oceanus, was born at sea. On November 9, 1620, after 66 grueling days, they sighted land, but it was the windswept shore of Cape Cod, hundreds of miles north of their intended destination near the Hudson River. They were outside their land patent, beyond the reach of English law. Anarchy loomed. The strangers were quick to grasp the situation. They argued that since the ship had not landed in Virginia, the contracts they had signed in England were void. They would use their own liberty, for none had power to command them. Facing a full-blown mutiny that would have fractured the colony before it even started, the separatist leaders, including William Bradford and William Brewster, were forced to act. The result was not a philosophical statement on democracy, but a pragmatic and desperate solution to a legal and social crisis. Drawing on the model of the self-governing covenants that structured their churches, they drafted a civil agreement. Signed on November 11, 1620, while the Mayflower was anchored in what is now Provincetown Harbor, the Mayflower Compact was a radical document born of necessity. The 41 adult male signatories bound themselves into a civil body politic and pledged to create and obey just and equal laws for the general good of the colony. It was the first framework for self-government written in the New World, an emergency measure that accidentally became a cornerstone of American political thought. The land the Pilgrims saw was no empty wilderness, as their writings sometimes suggested. For over 12,000 years, it had been the homeland of the Wampanoag Nation, the people of the first light. Their world was ancient, complex, and deeply interconnected. Before 1616, the Wampanoag were a powerful confederation of some 69 villages, with a total population estimated as high as 40,000 people. They were a semi-sedentary people, moving with the seasons between inland winter homes and coastal summer sites for farming, fishing, and hunting. Their society was matrilineal. Property and hereditary status were passed down through the mother's line, and female elders held significant power, including the authority to approve the selection of a sachem, or chief. Women were responsible for up to 75% of all food production, cultivating the three sisters: corn, beans, and squash. Their spirituality was woven into the fabric of daily life, based on a reciprocal relationship with nature and marked by frequent ceremonies of thanks for the Creator's gifts. They were not an isolated people, but part of a vast network of diplomacy, kinship, and trade that extended across the continent. But in the 3 years just before the Mayflower arrived, an unseen catastrophe had shattered this world. A plague brought by European traders swept through the coastal villages, a great dying that would irrevocably alter the course of history. Between 1616 and 1619, a virulent epidemic, now believed to have been leptospirosis, a bacterial disease likely spread by rats from European ships, decimated the coastal native population. The Wampanoag were hit hardest, losing an estimated 75 to 90% of their people. Entire villages were wiped out. The English colonists would later choose to settle in the abandoned Wampanoag village of Patuxet, which they renamed Plymouth. This apocalyptic event, more than any other single factor, enabled the English to establish a foothold. The Pilgrims, finding cleared fields, fresh water, and empty homes, interpreted the devastation as an act of divine providence, a sign that God had cleared the way for them. The Great Dying did more than kill. It radically shifted the balance of power in the region. The Wampanoag, led by their great sachem, Usamakqueen, were now critically vulnerable to their powerful rivals, the Narragansett tribe. The Narragansett, who lived further west in what is now Rhode Island, were largely spared by the epidemic that ravaged the Narragansett, who lived further west in what is now Rhode Island, were largely spared by the epidemic that ravaged the coastal communities. They now vastly outnumbered the weakened Wampanoag and began to assert their dominance, demanding tribute from Wampanoag villages. For Usamakqueen, whom the English called Massasoit, a title meaning Great Sachem, the arrival of the Mayflower was not a surprise, but a potential opportunity. He was facing an existential threat to his people's survival and autonomy. The alliance that would form between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag, often portrayed as a simple moment of cultural harmony, was in fact a direct and desperate geopolitical consequence of the Great Dying. Without the epidemic, the Pilgrims would have faced a powerful, populous nation, and the Wampanoag would have had no strategic need for an alliance with a small band of starving foreigners. The plague was the unspoken third party at the negotiating table. The Pilgrims' first winter was a mirror of the tragedy at Jamestown a decade earlier. Confined to the Mayflower and crude shelters on shore, sickness, scurvy, and starvation took a terrible toll. By the spring of 1621, only half of the 102 passengers and crew remained alive. Then, in March 1621, the struggling survivors received a stunning visitor. A native man walked boldly into their settlement and greeted them in broken English. "Welcome, Englishmen." He was Samoset, an Abenaki sachem from Maine who had learned the language from English fishermen. He stayed the night, sharing intelligence about the region, and promised to return with another who spoke English even better. The man Samoset brought with him was named Tisquantum, or Squanto, as the English called him. His life story is one of the most remarkable and tragic of the entire colonial era. Squanto was a member of the Patuxet tribe, a Wampanoag band whose village was the very site where the Pilgrims were now building Plymouth. In 1614, years before the epidemic, an English captain named Thomas Hunt had kidnapped Squanto and more than 20 other men to sell as slaves in Spain. Squanto was purchased by Spanish monks who freed him. He eventually made his way to England, where he lived for several years and learned English fluently. Finally, in 1619, he managed to secure passage back to his homeland as a guide on an exploratory expedition. He returned to find his entire village, his family, everyone he had ever known, gone, wiped out by the Great Dying. He was the last of the Patuxet. His unique position as a native of the land who was also a fluent English speaker made him invaluable to both sides. He taught the Pilgrims how to plant corn using fish as fertilizer, where to catch eels, and how to survive in their new environment. With Squanto acting as interpreter, the two leaders, Plymouth's Governor John Carver and the Wampanoag Great Sachem Usamakqueen, forged an alliance. It was a treaty of mutual defense, a pact for survival in a changed world. The treaty, established in March 1621, stipulated that neither party would harm the other, that they would aid each other in case of attack, and that they would serve as allies in war and peace. This alliance, born of mutual desperation, set the stage for the famous harvest celebration in the autumn of 1621. The only first-hand account of the event comes from a letter by Pilgrim Edward Winslow. It was not a religious thanksgiving as we know it, but a secular 3-day harvest festival, an English tradition. After a successful first harvest of Indian corn, the governor sent 4 men to hunt for fowl, likely ducks and geese, though perhaps a wild turkey. The celebration included recreations and the firing of their muskets. Hearing the gunfire, Usamequin arrived with 90 of his men, likely thinking the colony was under attack. Seeing it was a celebration, they joined in, and his hunters went out and brought back 5 deer to contribute to the feast. The menu was a blend of what the land provided: venison, wildfowl, corn in the form of porridge or bread, and likely an abundance of seafood like lobster, clams, and eels. But peace was more complicated than a shared meal. Squanto, the indispensable translator, began to see his unique position as a path to power, playing the English and his own people against each other for personal gain. A man without a tribe, Squanto's authority derived solely from his role as the sole interpreter between the two cultures. He began to leverage this power to usurp Usamequin's influence. He spread rumors to other tribes that the English kept the plague buried under their storehouse, and that he could command them to unleash it. He tried to manipulate the Pilgrims into attacking Usamequin's allies by fabricating reports of conspiracies. When Usamequin learned of this treachery, he was furious and demanded Squanto be handed over for execution, as was his right under the treaty. Governor Bradford refused, admitting in his journal that Squanto was too necessary and profitable an instrument to give up. This refusal to honor their agreement nearly shattered the fragile alliance. The alliance held for a generation, a period of uneasy peace. But as the English colony grew and thousands more settlers arrived in New England, the pressures on Wampanoag land and life became unbearable. The two worlds, once aligned in desperation, were now on a collision course. The fundamental conflict stemmed from 2 irreconcilable views of the land. For the Wampanoag, land was a communal resource to be shared and used. For the English, it was private property to be owned, fenced, and walled off. The English free-roaming livestock, particularly pigs and cattle, constantly destroyed the Wampanoag's unfenced cornfields, a major source of friction and economic damage. The imposition of the English legal system also undermined the traditional authority of the sachems, as colonists increasingly dealt with individual native peoples in land transactions, often of dubious legality. Amidst the growing tension, some Puritan missionaries, most notably John Eliot, sought to convert the native peoples. They established praying towns, self-governing communities where converts were expected to adopt not just Christianity, but English customs and culture. 14 such towns were established, including the prominent settlement at Natick. Native peoples moved to these towns for a variety of reasons: a genuine curiosity about the new faith, a desire for the security of English law, or simply as a means of economic survival in a rapidly changing world. Life in the praying towns required a complete cultural transformation, adopting English clothing, cutting their hair, and reversing traditional gender roles by having men work in the fields. This created a third group of people, caught between their ancestral lifeways and the encroaching English world, often distrusted by both sides. By 1675, the fragile peace shattered. Usamequin had died, and his son, Metacom, whom the English called King Philip, had become sachem. Facing the relentless loss of land and sovereignty, Metacom forged a multi-tribal alliance and launched a last desperate effort to drive the English out of New England. The result was King Philip's War, the deadliest conflict in American history per capita.
The war, which lasted just over a year, was an absolute catastrophe for both sides. Native warriors attacked more than half of all English towns in New England, completely destroying 12 of them. The colonial economy, particularly in Plymouth and Rhode Island, was left in ruins. But the English response was equally brutal. The praying Indians, despite their professed loyalty and offers to serve as scouts for the English, were seen as a fifth column. Hundreds were rounded up and forcibly interned on Deer Island in Boston Harbor. With little food or shelter, many starved or froze to death during the harsh winter. The English victory was total and unforgiving. Metacom was hunted down and killed in August 1676. His head was severed and displayed on a pike in Plymouth for a generation as a grim warning. For the Wampanoag and their allies, the aftermath was an annihilation. Their power as a political entity was broken. Their lands were confiscated. And in a final, brutal act, hundreds of survivors, including non-combatants who had surrendered under promises of mercy, were sold into the brutal sugar plantations of Bermuda and the Caribbean. Metacom's own wife and 9-year-old son were among those sold into foreign slavery, a fate many colonists debated was more merciful than execution. The Wampanoag were left effectively landless, their nation shattered, their families scattered across the globe. For over a century after the landing, Plymouth Rock was just another boulder on the shore. Its transformation into a sacred American relic began in 1741, with the fading memory of one old man. That year, as the town planned to build a wharf that would have buried the rock, a 94-year-old church elder named Thomas Fonts was carried to the shore. He declared that this specific boulder was the one his father, who arrived in 1623, and other original settlers had identified as the first landing place. Whether true or not, the story took hold. The rock's symbolism intensified on the eve of the American Revolution. In 1774, a group of Plymouth's Sons of Liberty decided to move the rock to the town's Liberty Pole Square as a political statement. As they tried to lift it with 20 yoke of oxen, the great stone split in two. This mishap was immediately interpreted by the Patriots as a powerful omen, a sign of the coming separation from Great Britain. One half was left at the shore, while the other was paraded to the town square. The two pieces would not be reunited until 1880, at which time the date 1620 was finally carved into its surface. As the young United States searched for a national identity, the complex, flawed, and often intolerant separatists were reborn in the American imagination as the Pilgrim Fathers, paragons of liberty and piety. The story of Plymouth was polished into a founding myth. This transformation was a deliberate process, occurring at key moments of national redefinition. It began during the Revolution, when the Pilgrims' break from England was used as a historical precedent for the colony's own struggle. The myth was cemented in 1820, at the bicentennial celebration of the landing. Standing beside the rock, the great orator Daniel Webster delivered a speech that would shape the nation's memory for generations. "We have come to this rock to record here our homage for our Pilgrim Fathers, our sympathy in their sufferings, our gratitude for their labors, our admiration of their virtues, our veneration of their piety, and our attachment to those principles of civil and religious liberty." Webster's powerful oration created a noble, quasi-religious origin story for the United States, one centered in New England and rooted in ideals of freedom. It conveniently ignored the earlier, more commercially driven settlement at Jamestown and completely erased the dark, bloody history of King Philip's War. Later in the 19th and early 20th centuries, as millions of Catholic and Jewish immigrants arrived from Europe, the story of the white Protestant pilgrims was again emphasized to assert a particular cultural identity for the nation. But for the descendants of the Wampanoag, this national myth was a painful erasure of their history. In 1970, on the 350th anniversary of the landing, they resolved to speak their truth.